Sunday school teacher, I'm glad that you've joined us to spend some time in preparation for this coming Sunday's Bible study time. We begin a new series this week. We're going to be in 2 Samuel. Let me go ahead and give you some tips here because I'm fearful that your people are going to get lost in some of the history. I'm afraid they're going to get a little confused when it comes to the places and also to all of the players, the people who are involved in these Bible studies. So I would encourage you to go ahead, get you two pieces of poster board, and one is people and the other is places, and every week add the names of the people and the places that are mentioned in these studies. We're not going to look at every verse in 2 Samuel, and we're not going to cover all of the people who were involved in 2 Samuel, nor all the places. But we are going to hit the highlights. And again, if you're not careful, you're going to get caught in a lot of the details and miss the application. And so I'm going to try to help you with that as we go through it. But it is a lot of history, a lot of events that we're going to be hearing about. So let's jump in there. We're looking at the lesson for June the 3rd. The title of the lesson is Respected, and we're in 2 Samuel chapter 1, and we're going to be in chapter 2. And the point of the lesson, and that's going to be very important as you go through these, is always coming back to what is the title, what is the point, what's the purpose of this Bible study, what's the goal. The point of this lesson is that God calls individuals to lead His people, and they should be honored as such. In other words, those leaders that God calls, they should be honored. As we think about the book of 2 Samuel, it is about David. He is the ruler of Israel who, the lineage of David, God would promise that one day He would send an everlasting righteous ruler, the Messiah. And that's the reason that David was chosen, was because it was through his family line that eventually we would have Jesus. 2 Samuel records the story, the history of David's 40-year reign as king. It's from the time that he gained the throne until his death. It begins with David's response to the news that Saul and Jonathan had been killed. Now remember that Jonathan was Saul's son and was David's best friend. A young Amalekite arrived with the news of Saul's defeat and Saul's death. And this Amalekite presented three forms of evidence to support his story that Saul was dead. Number one, he claimed that he had happened upon King Saul dying in the battlefield. And that's in verse 6 of chapter 1. And then in verses 7 through 9, this Amalekite stated that he engaged Saul in a conversation, and that conversation was Saul saying, "I'm about to die, my enemies are coming, please finish the deed and kill me." And so that's what he did. And then finally he said in verse 10 that he showed the items, the crown, he showed the items to David that he had brought off of Saul and Jonathan's body. A crown, arm patches, and then some jewelry. Rather than rewarding the Amalekite for his role in Saul's death, David executed him. And the reason that he did so was because he had struck a blow against the Lord's anointed, God's chosen King Saul. And afterwards, David memorialized Saul and Jonathan, and that's where we pick up. And so in chapter 1, beginning in verse 22, he says, Jonathan's bow never retreated. Saul's sword never returned unstained from the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty. Saul and Jonathan, loved and delightful. They were not parted in life nor in death. They were swifter than the eagles, stronger than the lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxurious things, who decked your garments with gold ornaments. How the mighty have fallen in the thick of battle. Jonathan lies slain in the heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother, for such a friend to me. Your love for me was more wondrous than the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war have perished. So here we have the commemoration of Saul and Jonathan by David. This was a very big defeat for the nation of Israel. Their king, their warriors had been defeated. But instead of focusing on that, David begins by talking about the numerous achievements in the battlefield. We see in these verses that David says that Saul and Jonathan had a personal charm. That's one of the gifts of a politician, is to be able to relate to individuals. In verse 24, we see that it was Saul that was responsible for maintaining the conditions that made it possible for the economic growth of the nation of Israel. And David said to the folks, you need to remember that Saul is the one who has done this. And then in verse 25, he says, how the mighty have fallen. This appears 3 times in this section. And so once again, he's talking about the mighty. The word there is the champion, the winner, the one who has been undefeated is now defeated. And in verse 26, that verse has been misinterpreted by some of those who would say that Jonathan and David had a homosexual relationship, and you may have heard that, and some of the people in your class may have heard that. But that is the farthest thing from the truth. This statement that David makes about Jonathan and the relationship that they had, that his love was more wondrous than that of a woman, he's not talking about a sexual relationship. He's not talking about that kind of love. In our culture, a husband and wife are best friends. The woman is the most trusted companion. There are conversations that a husband and a wife have that are more intimate and more detailed. That's what David is talking about here. He's not talking about a sexual relationship. He's talking about the fact that I could talk to Jonathan about stuff that I couldn't talk to anybody else about. And so that's what he's talking about. Jonathan was his most trusted friend. And then in verse 27, he ends by saying that the best weapons, the weapons that Israel had used for victory were now gone. And so he ends there in verse 27. And then we see in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, we see the coronation. Sometime later, David inquired of the Lord, should I go to one of the towns of Judah? The Lord answered him, go. Then David asked, where should I go? To Hebron, the Lord replied. So David went there with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. In addition, David brought the men who were with him, each one with his own family, and they settled in the towns near Hebron. Then in verse 4, the men of Judah came, and they there anointed David as king over the house of Judah. They told David, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, the Lord bless you because you have shown kindness to Saul, your Lord, when you buried him. Now may the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness and I will show you the same goodness to you because what you have done in this deed. Therefore be strong, though Saul your Lord is dead, the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. And so here we have in these verses David trying to determine what's the next step. More than likely what he did, he cast lots. And so in this decision-making process, he asked the Lord, where should we go? Should I go? And then where should I go? And so it was Hebron. And so in your notes, I've given you 6 reasons why Hebron was a significant city for him to go. Number 1, it possessed strong roots for Israel's history. It's also located within the territory of Judah, which was his people. It was a prominent city of refuge in the region. In other words, even though he had nothing to do with Saul's death, there may be those that would say he did. It was a family connection that ensured local support, and also it's where the priests lived. And it could be easily supported. It could easily support the increased population of David and his troops. We see that David went there with his wives, and also there were about 1,000 people that accompanied him. And then the first step we see in verse 4, the first part of verse 4, was for David in becoming king over all of Israel, was for him to become the leader of his own tribe. And then we see in the latter part of verse 4 through verse 7, the commendation. It says in verse 4, those who came were the family leaders of Judah. So they traveled to Hebron to anoint David as the king. And then in verse 5, we see that David sent a delegation to travel back from Hebron to Jabesh Gilead to deliver a message to the people. And that message was, you are blessed. That is, that you are going to be endowed with power, and that power will result in success and prosperity. So David's prayer or blessing called on God to show kindness and faithfulness, and we see that in verse 7. The faithfulness is that of God's steadfast love that resulted in trust. That's the kindness. And then the faithfulness, that's truthfulness and authenticity. And so that's the blessing. In verse 7, he wraps it up by saying, even in the face of great loss, they had lost their king, their ruler, their first king. Even in great loss and even in great grief, God's people could trust Him to provide new leadership for the future. So what are we trying to communicate in this lesson? 3 things. Number 1, believers can celebrate the faithful service of the leaders that God has called. Number 2, believers must seek God and His timing. And number 3, believers should honor the Lord's leaders that are provided to them. Those that have been in the past, those who have been serving in the present, and those who will serve in the future. So we think about creating interest in this lesson. The first thing I would encourage you to do is maybe write the names of leaders that they have respect for. Who is it that you in your class, think about local community leaders, maybe even some people within the church or national leaders, those that are presently serving, and maybe it could be a historical figure, somebody that they respect. And then state that in today's study we're going to discover what it really means to respect our leaders. And that's what David did even with Saul. Even though Saul had persecuted him, hunted him, he still respected God's chosen. And then closing this out, just give your people the name and address of a staff member or a church leader, maybe the names of the deacons and their addresses, and then give them a thank you card for them to write a personal note to one leader from your church, pastor, staff, Sunday school teachers, deacons, somebody who's serving as a leader, and say, write a thank you note to them this week, thanking them for what they do. Well, I'll be praying for you as you teach this coming Sunday. God bless you.